Chapter 6. Reporting for Duty. Vietnam. When I first set foot on Camp Pendleton, full of anticipation and ready to embrace whatever Marine Corps life had in store, I was greeted with an unexpected twist. The entire base was on holiday lockdown. That's right, completely closed, as if the military itself had hit the snooze button for the season. To top it off, I was informed that Vietnam staging, the very reason I was there, wouldn't commence until December 30th. The timing couldn't have been more spiritless. While the rest of the world was wrapped in festive cheer, I was left stranded in a barren, holidayless limbo, painfully aware that home and family were hundreds of miles away. Before leaving Quincy, I had the foresight to request an extra 2-day leave to spend Christmas at home, but the Marine Corps, in its infinite wisdom, denied my plea. Apparently, Santa wasn't the only one reviewing lists and rejecting requests that year. So there I was, stuck in Southern California with nothing to do but count the hours until Monday. But not all was lost. In a rare stroke of holiday goodwill, I managed to salvage some semblance of cheer by visiting my 2 uncles and their families in Anaheim, just an hour's drive north. It wasn't quite the same as being home with my parents and siblings, but it was a small consolation, a fleeting taste of family during a season that seemed otherwise determined to leave me out in the cold. Christmas Day may not have been the one I'd hoped for, but at least it wasn't completely devoid of warmth and connection. Small victories, I suppose. Preparation for deployment to Vietnam kicked off with a 2-week crash course in infantry training, paired with a delightful menu of inoculations, medical exams, and a mountain of paperwork. The shots were a non-negotiable insurance policy against the smorgasbord of exotic and often lethal diseases lurking in the jungles of South Vietnam. Among the many jabs, the infamous gamma globulin shot took center stage, a whopper of an injection delivered to the posterior with a needle that felt more suited for veterinary use. The aftermath? A throbbing, swollen reminder that lingered for days. By the end of it all, I wasn't so much a Marine as I was a human pincushion with paperwork. On January 11, 1969, I embarked on an overseas journey aboard a Continental Airlines Boeing 707 jet airliner chartered by the U.S. military. Departing from El Toro Marine Air Base near Irvine, California, just 35 miles from Camp Pendleton, the aircraft was packed with fellow Marines bound for Vietnam. As the engines roared to life and the plane ascended, a heavy sense of solemnity filled the cabin. Each of us grappled with the weight of the unknown, bracing for the challenges waiting on foreign soil. I was resolute in my duty to serve my country with honor, yet I couldn't shake the lingering question: when the first shot came my way, would I rise as a hero or falter in fear? As the tension dissolved, we all began to mingle. With 17 hours of travel stretched out before us, the Marines broke the ice by swapping tales and dealing out cards. The more extroverted among them even turned their charm on the young airmaids, while the ever-cheerful stewardesses glided through the aisles with refreshments in hand. Many of us opted for something stronger than soda, and it appeared that somewhere over the ocean, the airline either had the liberty to serve minors or simply figured we'd earned a stiff drink. After all, this wasn't exactly a flight bound for Disneyland. While the plane paused to refuel at Honolulu Airport in Hawaii, we were granted the rare privilege of stretching our legs and sampling the island's mild, temperate evening. The balmy ocean breeze wrapped around us like a warm embrace, and a table adorned with cups of golden pineapple juice awaited, each sip far sweeter and more divine than anything I'd ever tasted before. Of course, paradise came with strings attached. Passengers were corralled within a few feet of the aircraft, hemmed in by white barricades as military police stood watch, ensuring no one made a daring dash into the tropical dreamscape just beyond our reach. Less than 20 minutes later, we were herded back on board, still far from our final destination. Our next stop in Guam promised no such reprieve, leaving us to savor this fleeting taste of island life. On January 12th, we touched down at Kadena Air Force Base, perched on the midwestern coast of Okinawa, by mid-afternoon. From there, we were promptly shuttled 6 miles north to Camp Hansen Marine Corps Base. Upon arrival, we were assigned sleeping quarters for the night and stashed our sea bags, along with most of our uniforms, in a storage building that would be patiently waiting for us upon our return. We were allowed to bring a few personal items and a modest selection of clothing for the journey ahead, enough to see us through until our R&R, rest and relaxation week, a much-anticipated reprieve midway through our tour. Along with our essentials, we were instructed to pack a Class A dress uniform for Vietnam. When one Marine dryly observed that it might be for dressing us up in a casket if we didn't make it back, another Marine countered with a dash of optimism, quipping that he planned to wear his for years to come, and not in a box. The group chuckled, shaking off the heavy undertone with a shared moment of levity, before continuing with their conversation. After spending just one night in Okinawa, we reboarded the same Continental Airlines airplane and continued to Da Nang Air Base in South Vietnam. As we neared our destination, a young stewardess spoke over the intercom to give us our debarkation instructions. Her once cheerful and playful voice began to falter and stutter as she struggled to finish her instructions, a stark contrast to the talkative and playful demeanor we had encountered before. As we filed out of the aircraft, the stewardesses appeared somber, with some fighting back tears and unable to make eye contact. One of them whispered, "My God, they all look so young." Just as I reached the exit, a raven-haired beauty gently planted a kiss on my cheek and said, "God be with you, Marine." It became a warm and poignant memory that I frequently relived during the lonely nights ahead, absent of any female contact. Stepping into the blinding daylight of Vietnam, I found myself squinting against the merciless glare of the midday sun, which seemed hell-bent on roasting the earth and everything on it. The heat and humidity wrapped around me like a suffocating, invisible straitjacket, transforming every inhale into a labored gasp of sticky, sweltering air, nothing remotely like the comfortable breezes I'd once taken for granted. It was as though I had wandered into some sadistic episode of The Twilight Zone, where the oppressive climate was the only plot twist. Little did I know, this was merely the beginning of an unrelenting test of endurance. As the plane raced down the runway and lifted into the air, my eyes clung to the vanishing outline of home until it was swallowed by the horizon. A flurry of emotions churned within me, fear, naturally, but also a peculiar mixture of pride and determination. This wasn't just about me anymore. I was part of something larger, a mission with weight and meaning. Whatever challenges lay in wait, I was ready to meet them head-on, sweaty uniform and all. Da Nang lay roughly 85 miles south of the demilitarized zone along the southeastern coast of South Vietnam, a tense boundary splitting North and South Vietnam. As soon as we reached the edge of the airport, a middle-aged sergeant with a gravelly voice bellowed, "Move! Move! Move!" He wasted no time, herding us off the airfield with practiced authority. We were ushered into a single file line near a cluster of 4 large olive-green canvas tents, clearly marked as the Marine Corps receiving area. In front of the tents stood a folding table slapped together as a makeshift desk. We waited in line, shuffling forward as a clerk prepared to hand out our orders, unit assignments, and destinations. When it was my turn, the receiving clerk scanned the list of papers clipped to his weathered clipboard, locating my name and unit. With a curt nod, he stamped my orders with an ink blotter, assigning me to the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marine Regiment, 3rd Marine Division. The same dispersing sergeant who had led us to the receiving station informed me that I'd be spending the night in one of the tents, tucked behind the receiving area. He added, almost nonchalantly, that the next morning I'd need to board a CH-130 cargo plane bound for Quang Tri Combat Base, situated a grueling 115 miles north of Da Nang. From there, I'd have to catch a ride with a truck convoy to reach Vandergrift Combat Base, the nerve center where my unit was stationed. I couldn't help but be taken aback by the sergeant's laid-back demeanor. Back in the States, my every move was shadowed by non-commissioned officers, ensuring I got where I needed to be. Yet, here in Vietnam, I was left to decipher the chaotic maze on my own. It made me yearn for the sharp bark of a sergeant's orders, the comforting clarity of someone steering me in the right direction. The tents in the receiving area were strikingly familiar, identical to the ones I had used during my ITR training in California, with their sides rolled up to battle the oppressive Vietnam heat. But one glaring difference stood out immediately. These tents were encircled by a double-stacked wall of sandbags. It was an unrelenting reminder that I was no longer in a training ground, but deep in a war zone, where the looming danger of enemy rockets or mortar fire was an inescapable reality. Unwinding in the tent proved impossible, and a creeping sense of isolation began to settle in. What unnerved me most was the absence of anyone else from my unit. While others forged new friendships and camaraderie with fellow Marines, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was navigating a separate, lonelier road entirely. At approximately 5 p.m. that evening, a thunderous voice erupted in front of my tent. "Anyone here headed to the 2-4?" Looking up, I saw a Marine who seemed ripped straight from a recruitment poster. His perfectly composed appearance radiated the essence of a true warrior. Though we were similar in height and weight, his powerful muscular frame and broad shoulders made him tower in presence. A mischievous grin hinted at a rebellious streak, yet beneath the rugged exterior lay a sharp mind and a kind heart, qualities that truly set him apart. "I'm heading to 2-4. What's your name?" I called back. "Awesome, dude. I'm Dan Wessler. And you?" "Dan Wagoner. Looks like we're running a Dan convention here." I laughed. "When'd you get in? I didn't see you on my flight," Wessler asked, stepping closer. "I've been here since this morning. Honestly, I was starting to think I'd have to make the trip to Vandergrift solo," I replied. Wessler chuckled. "What have you been doing all day? This place isn't exactly brimming with entertainment. Just tents and an airfield as far as I can see." "Ah, Danny boy," he teased. "There's a whole city out there. Bars, girls, the works. My brother was stationed here with the Navy in '67 and fed me the inside scoop on all the must-visit spots in Da Nang." Wessler grinned. "All right, Danny boy. We're going to need to sort out this Dan situation. It's already getting weird. Got a nickname?" I thought for a second and said, "Well, I've got 2 brothers who used to go by Big Wags and Little Wags when they were kids. How about just calling me Wags?" "Wags it is," Wessler declared. "So, Wags, how big's your family?" "Just the 2 older brothers," I said. "I'm the baby of the bunch. My brother Ron's an Air Force captain, and Wally, the oldest, teaches high school history." "How about you, Dan? Tell me about your family." 4 boys total," Wessler said. "All D names. Dick and Dave are my older brothers, and the youngest, Dean, is just 11. He's my little buddy." Dan Wessler, a fellow from Vancouver, WA, turned out to be an unexpected mirror of my own childhood, a revelation that was as intriguing as it was comforting. Despite my natural inclination toward introversion, we hit it off effortlessly, which spoke volumes about Dan's outgoing charm and charisma. While forging new friendships wasn't exactly my forte, Dan made it feel like second nature. Having him around was like carrying a cheat code for life in Vietnam. Suddenly, the daunting task of navigating this unfamiliar terrain felt far less menacing, and I had a trusty co-pilot for the journey to our unit. Neither of us went out on the town that night. It was like the 2 of us hitting it off and chatting until we finally needed to sleep. The next morning we set out to locate the staging area for outbound flights. A corporal, half hidden behind the open window of the transportation building, lazily signed us in for our trip to Quang Tri, headquarters for the 4th Marines. And then came the flight. The hop from Da Nang to Quang Tri aboard the CH-130 wasn't just a flight. It was a heart-pounding thrill ride that could have been the crown jewel of any amusement park, assuming said park was located in a war zone and catered exclusively to adrenaline junkies with questionable life insurance policies. We boarded the hulking cargo plane via the rear loading ramp, our jaws dropping at the sheer size of the beast. Painted in a war-weathered mix of black and light brown, the plane looked like a bruised dinosaur brought to life. It was powered by 4 thirsty turboprop engines, stretching 40 feet in length and nearly 10 feet across, an airborne fortress with plenty of scars to prove it. Dan and I found seats, or rather, floor space, on the cargo bay's hard metal surface, strapped in by white canvas belts that didn't inspire much confidence. Around us, a dozen other passengers jostled for position next to pallets piled high with supplies, sea rations, and munitions. The crew, meanwhile, moved with practiced ease, cinched into their belts as they roamed the cabin. Their combat-ready appearance stood out, worn green flight suits and .45 caliber pistols slung low on their hips, a tough guy uniform that only experience could properly age. As the engines roared to life, I glanced out the 2-foot-wide window beside me and froze. A bullet hole, sharp and deliberate, pierced the center of the glass. "Wessler, check this out, man. This window's got a bullet hole clean through the middle." Wessler leaned over, raising an eyebrow. "You think we might get shot at, Wags?" "Don't know, man. The engines are revving up, and I can hardly hear you. But I'll tell you one thing. This old bird looks like it's held together with duct tape and good intentions. Lordy, this thing's got Moses beat in age. I just hope we get off the ground." The plane lurched forward, shuddering and rattling like an old lawnmower struggling to start. As we sped down the runway, the vibrations grew so intense I thought we were coming apart at the seams. The airman seated next to us smirked as we flailed to keep steady, our canvas belts the only thing keeping us from sprawling. And then, because the universe loves to mess with you, I spotted it. A loose bolt, nut, and washer dropping neatly from a skeletal girder above. The airman, clearly enjoying the show, scooped up the fallen pieces with a chuckle, holding them aloft like a prize catch before tucking them into his pocket. The guy was having way too much fun watching 2 tough Marines squirm. Finally, we hit cruising altitude, and the CH-130 banked out over the South China Sea, where the threat of enemy fire diminished with each passing mile. The engines still grumbled, the cabin still rattled, but at least the jungle's gunfire couldn't reach us here. In less than an hour, we were wheels down at Quang Tri Combat Base, just 10 miles south of Dong Ha and 18 miles shy of the demilitarized zone, alive, intact, and slightly more appreciative of solid ground. Upon arriving in Quang Tri, we checked in at the 4th Marine Regimental Headquarters. A no-nonsense Marine sergeant wasted no time, escorting us to our temporary lodgings, OD green canvas tents that smelled faintly of mildew and dirt. That night, under the dim glow of a single lantern, we traded stories of home and indulged in exaggerated high school memories, searching for comfort in familiarity. The next morning, Dan and I were summoned for a truck convoy heading to Vandegrift Combat Base, the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines headquarters. A burly sergeant managing the convoy waved vaguely at a fleet of 6x6 trucks and barked, "Find an empty spot on one of those trucks and climb aboard. You two are good to go." "Hey, Sergeant, we've got no weapons," Wessler objected, gesturing at our unarmed selves. "You'll pick one up when you get to Stud, Marine," the sergeant said gruffly. "What's Stud?" Dan asked, his brow furrowing. "Stud's what we call Vandegrift Combat Base, genius." But what if we get hit before we get there? Don't sweat it. The other Marines will keep you safe. Now stop wasting my time and get moving. You'll get your rifles when you check in. Let's move out, Marines. With no better options, we scrambled onto the nearest truck, squeezing into what little space remained with the other passengers. The engines roared to life, and the convoy jerked forward, stirring up a gritty cloud of dust as we rumbled onto Route 1. The road was rough, each bump threatening to knock us skyward, and the heat seemed determined to cook us alive. Still, a strange mix of nerves and anticipation kept us alert. "Darn it, does this driver hit every bump on purpose?" I muttered under my breath. The Marine next to me, a brooding lance corporal, glared at us, cigarette balanced between his fingers. He was an imposing figure, tall, with thick, curly black hair, piercing green-blue eyes, and a light brown complexion. A dense black mustache sat atop his prominent nose like a shield. "You two FNGs just arrived, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "FNGs?" I asked, unsure if I should be insulted. "Freaking new guys. Dead giveaway, those stateside utilities you're wearing. Dead giveaway." Lance Corporal Miller sneered. Dan bristled at the tone, glaring at the man as though weighing whether to argue. "What's with the attitude, Lance Corporal? Boot camp's over, isn't it? Weren't you new once, too?" "Relax, newbie," Miller replied, taking a long drag of his cigarette. "I just got back from R&R in Bangkok, and coming back to this hellhole doesn't exactly improve my mood." "Got any advice for us?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation somewhere useful. He exhaled a plume of smoke and looked me square in the eye. "Yeah. Forget everything you think you learned stateside. None of it matters here. This place doesn't play by the rules. Every mistake has a body count. Keep your head down, follow orders, and maybe, just maybe, you'll get out of here with all your parts intact." "Got it?" "Got it," I said quietly. "Yeah, no problem," Wessler added, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Brace yourselves for the worst days of your sorry little lives, cherries." Miller snorted with a dark chuckle. "Like what?" I prodded, half curious, half dreading what the grizzled Marine. "Let's start with listening posts," Miller began, his tone dripping with foreboding. "Not exactly a vacation spot. It's just you and two other unlucky bastards, stuck far from the main lines, sitting ducks for gooks, or worse, the man-eating tigers." "Tigers?" I said, blinking in disbelief. "And make no mistake, cherries. Charlie's not just good at his job. He's real good. Better than you? That's for damn sure." He shot us a mocking smile. "Now, you pair of FNGs, enjoy this ride while it lasts. You won't be getting any more of these cushy trips where you're headed." As we rolled forward, our senses stayed razor sharp, scanning for even the faintest hint of trouble. The .50 caliber machine gun perched atop the lead truck wasn't just a weapon. It was a looming symbol, a grim reminder that danger could spring from the shadows at any moment. We were coiled tight, ready to react to whatever the road threw at us. Heading north along Route 1, the landscape unfolded like a living tapestry. Flat farmland stretched out in neat rows, rice paddies weaving a patchwork quilt of greens in every imaginable shade. Barefoot farmers clad in traditional garb guided their patient water buffalo in a slow, deliberate rhythm through the fields. It struck me how Vietnam seemed to hold beauty in its every corner, even amidst the tension, and how its people moved with a grace that was almost poetic. As we left Dong Ha behind, the coastline's vibrant swaths of green began to fade into more muted tones. The road veered onto Route 9, where smooth pavement gave way to a relentless stretch of jagged dirt. The convoy jolted and swayed, each bump kicking up plumes of gritty red dust that clung to our skin and filled our lungs. Passing through the small village of Cam Lo, we were greeted by a swarm of eager Vietnamese children darting alongside the convoy, their energy a sharp contrast to the somber mood of the Marines. They clamored for handouts, candy, cigarettes, anything we could spare. My stomach churned as I watched. Children barely old enough to count to 10, puffing on cigarettes far too large for their tiny hands and mouths. It was jarring, yet many of the Marines didn't bat an eye. Miller, in particular, seemed to find amusement in their desperation, teasing the kids with his cigarette pack, dangling it just out of reach before flicking the occasional smoke their way. A knot formed in my chest as I took it all in, the innocence of childhood, so casually eroded by the chaos of war. These kids should have been laughing over games, learning their letters, chasing dreams, not cigarettes. Instead, they were scavenging scraps from soldiers. The juxtaposition hit hard, beauty and brutality, side by side. This was war's unflinching legacy, careless and cruel, leaving its scars on even the smallest of souls. The convoy veered southwest, and soon the rock pile loomed in the distance like a silent sentinel. As we entered the rugged mountains, the thick forest closed in around us, wrapping the convoy in a shroud of unease. The tension was intense, a silent hum in the air as every Marine remained on edge. Reaching our destination felt like exhaling after holding our breath for far too long, a relief that came at the end of a journey fraught with nerves. At long last, we rolled into Vandegrift Combat Base. The trucks groaned to a stop, and we spilled out like tightly wound springs finally released. Stretching our legs never felt so glorious. We were grateful, not just for the solid ground beneath our feet, but for the sharp eyes and steady hands of our convoy's protectors, who had delivered us safely across the gauntlet. Vandegrift Combat Base, affectionately nicknamed Stud, was strategically perched about 10 miles south of the demilitarized zone and 8 miles northeast of the infamous Khe Sanh. When Khe Sanh Combat Base shut its gates, Vandegrift stepped up as the new headquarters for the 3rd Marine Division, cementing its place on the map. Tucked snugly within a valley stretching 3 miles long and 2 miles wide, Vandegrift was hemmed in by the towering 700-foot peaks of the New Bai Ho Mountains, a natural fortress of sorts. Encircled by these brooding giants, the base had an air of rugged defiance. Nearby, Signal Hill, a modest grassy knoll, played a pivotal role as a telecommunication hub. Here, forward air observers kept watch, ever ready to orchestrate airstrikes with precision and flair. The airstrip buzzed with frenetic energy, a veritable hive where twin-rotored CH-46 Sea Knights, beefy CH-47 Chinooks, and the mammoth C-53 Sea Stallion helicopters danced through the skies, ferrying Marines and their gear with clinical precision. This base wasn't just a logistical hub. It was the lifeline for Marines scattered across northern I Corps and served as the fiery springboard for combat missions plunging into the dense, unforgiving jungle, the infamous bush. Encircling Vandegrift was a formidable ring of fortified bunkers, meticulously arranged to turn back any unwelcome visitors. Beyond the perimeter lay an intimidating ensemble, snarling coils of concertina wire, strategically planted claymore mines, watchful sensor devices, and trip flares poised to snitch on any approaching foes. The base's interior was a patchwork of tents and plywood structures, including an armory, ammo depot, chow hall, supply shack, and the ever-essential PX. Each building and tent was cocooned in sandbags, an improvised armor against the unwelcome greetings of rockets and mortars. Ingenious plumbing solutions included 6-inch PVC pipes rigged as urinals, tilted just right for ease of use, and sticking 2.5 feet out of the ground like awkward sentinels. For more demanding needs, traditional outhouses, affectionately dubbed shitters, were scattered throughout, ensuring no corner of the base was left unserved. Reporting to headquarters, Dan Wessler and I were both chomping at the bit to land in the same platoon. As we stepped into the modest plywood shack that passed for a building, we were met by an office clerk, One of those poor souls the combat Marines sarcastically dubbed Pug. The moniker, dripping with disdain, was reserved for any Marine stuck in rear duty who conveniently sidestepped the rough and tumble grind. His desk was a chaotic battlefield of its own, littered with a manual Remington typewriter and teetering stacks of unfiled paperwork. Behind him, a cluster of smaller offices buzzed with the activity of staff NCOs and officers, each buried in their own brand of bureaucratic warfare. The wiry office clerk, his face peppered with pimples, grinned at us like a fox eyeing a pair of plump hens. "Reporting for duty, Lance Corporal," I announced, resisting the urge to wipe the grin off his face with a glare. "Welcome, newbies. How was the scenic route in?" "Fine, if you like eating your weight in dust," Wessler quipped. "Otherwise, uneventful." "Sounds delightful," the clerk snickered, clearly enjoying his position of petty authority. "Sit tight. I'll grab the S1 officer. He likes to chat up the fresh meat." A few moments later, the Lance Corporal returned, puffing himself up like a rooster. "A tin hut?" he squawked, his attempt at formality so anemic it was almost cute. From one of the offices emerged a young Marine lieutenant, his tight buzz cut and crisply starched jungle utilities giving him the aura of someone who probably folded his socks with a ruler. "At ease, Marines," he said, his tone brisk but not unkind. "I'm First Lieutenant Boggs, Battalion Personnel Officer. I make it a point to meet the new replacements when I can. Any hiccups getting here?" "No, sir," Wessler and I chorused. "Good. Welcome aboard. We'll get you squared away shortly. Before we dive into the paperwork, though, either of you know how to type?" The room grew so silent you could hear the dust motes collide mid-air. I wasn't about to volunteer that my high school typing teacher considered me a rising star. I hadn't signed up for the Corps to play secretary. A sideways glance at Wessler confirmed he was on the same page. The man had edited his high school yearbook's sports section, but there wasn't a chance in hell he was confessing to that now. "No?" Lieutenant Boggs filled the silence, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Got it. Infantry company it is. Go find some shade outside the command hooch and park yourselves. I'll hand off your personnel files to the acting top, Sergeant Faitala Ello, and Lance Corporal Baker will fetch you when your papers are finished. Good luck, Marines." Dan Wessler and I scouted out a sliver of shade on the south side of the headquarters building, settling ourselves side saddle along a ragged stack of sandbags. The sun wasn't letting up, and neither were the gnats. "Hurry up and wait," Dan muttered, his voice tinged with that familiar mix of sarcasm and resignation. "Textbook Marine Corps procedure. Kill yourself getting to the spot, then sit on your hands and wait. Doesn't matter if it's the States or halfway across the world, same old song." "Preach it, brother," I replied, swatting at a particularly persistent gnat. "Who knows how long we'll roast in this heat? These little bastards are already making a meal of me. Want a cigarette, Wags?" Dan pulled out a pack of unfiltered Camels and held out his gift. "Nah, I'll pass. I hear those things can kill you," I said with mock seriousness, breaking into a wide grin. "Really, Dan, you should quit while you're ahead." A beat of silence was all it took for the absurdity to sink in, and we both dissolved into laughter, our shoulders shaking as the tension of the day melted away for a moment. "Yeah, Wags, I'm real concerned about dropping dead from nicotine out here," he said, still chuckling. "Real top of my list." "So, you got a girl waiting back home, Dan?" I asked, shifting the conversation. "Yeah. Her name's Cindy. She's a sweetheart. Here, take a look." He pulled out a dog-eared photo from his pocket, the kind of keepsake every Marine seemed to carry. It was black and white, but even grainy film couldn't hide her beauty. Long hair cascading to her shoulders, and a smile so radiant it could derail a freight train. "She's a knockout," I said, nodding in admiration. "You're a lucky guy. What about you? You got someone special, Wags? I hesitated, my grin slipping for just a second. Nope. Used to, but not anymore. Dan caught the flicker of pain in my expression and wisely backed off, letting the silence settle between us like a truce. Cindy and I, we almost tied the knot, Dan offered after a beat, his voice quieter now. That's huge, man. But wait, almost? I asked, raising an eyebrow. She wanted to go through with it, but... Dan hesitated, scratching at the back of his neck. I didn't want to leave her with a question mark for a husband. If something happens to me, it wouldn't be fair. Cut that crap out, will you? I said, leaning into my best John Wayne drawl. You're going to make it home in one piece, partner. You're too tough for Mr. Charles to handle. Dan smirked at my over-the-top impression, shaking his head. Yeah, Wags, whatever you say. As our conversation deepened, we found ourselves circling back to the shared dream that kept us going. Muscle cars, those gleaming beasts of power and speed, were the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for us baby boomers. We talked through our plans to save every hard-earned dollar from our overseas deployment. With combat pay and hazardous duty pay added to our regular military salary, the dream of owning one felt closer than ever. Let's break it down, Wags, Dan Wessler declared, his voice a blend of confidence and cautious optimism. A private first class pulls in about $120 a month. Add another $35 in combat and hazardous duty pay, and you're looking at $150. That's 13 months of banking $150. We're talking over $1,200. And don't forget, there's always a chance we'll get promoted. What are we going to do with all that scratch, huh? Hold up, Wessler. Check this out, I said, pulling out a carefully folded page from Time magazine like it was the Holy Grail. A brand new Dodge Challenger. Feast your eyes on this beauty. Have you ever seen anything this sweet? Damn, Wags, that's a thing of beauty. You seriously thinking about snagging one of these bad boys when we're home? You better believe it, Mr. Wessler. This baby's got some serious bite, especially if I can swing the big block Hemi engine. Picture me cruising downtown Quincy, Illinois, turning heads left and right in this sweet ride. I'll be the king of Broadway Street. I carefully folded the picture, tucking it back into my shirt pocket as if it were a lucky charm. It was more than paper to me. It was a symbol, a carrot dangling in front of the grind, a promise that something better waited at the end of this long deployment. I grinned and started telling Dan about the Quincy Loop, where local teens cruised from 12th Street to 30th along Broadway, hunting for girls and showing off their rides. Muscle cars reigned supreme, and whoever had the flashiest set of wheels got the most attention. Wessler laughed and said he had a similar scene back in Vancouver. That was it. We made a pact. When I got back from Vietnam, I'd drive my new Challenger to Vancouver, Washington, and we'd take his loop by storm. 2 muscle car kings, trading the grind of war for the thrill of the open road. 30 minutes later, the pimple-pocked office clerk slithered out and summoned us back into the headquarters building, his lips curled into a sly grin. With a dramatic flourish, he handed over our unit assignments. Leaning back in his creaky chair, the smug little bureaucrat laced his fingers behind his greasy neck and let out a self-satisfied chuckle. Congrats, boys. You're officially part of Golf Company, better known as Graveyard Golf. Sure, you could have ended up in Hotel Fox or even Echo Company, but nope. Lady Luck decided to drop you with the unit boasting the most KIA in the battalion. That's killed in action, if you're not keeping score. Best of luck out there, newbies. Dan and I shared a glance, fighting the urge to knock the smirk off his face while the weight of his words settled in. Graveyard golf. Not exactly the kind of assignment that inspires warm fuzzies. Nervously, we exchanged faint smiles and trudged off toward Golf Company headquarters, a squat building sulking in the shadow of the battalion command post 50 yards away. The Golf Company headquarters stood as a sprawling wooden hooch, a twin to those scattered across Da Nang and Quang Tri. Out front loomed a billboard-sized sign showcasing a painted mountain, its rugged peak crowned by a pair of jungle boots climbing ever upward. Above this bold tableau were the words, Golf Company, the grunts who hump with angels. Beneath it, in a flourish of pride and humor, read the tagline, Utterly Magnificent. Sergeant Faitala Allo, who had just stepped into the role of acting top sergeant after his predecessor rotated home a few weeks earlier, greeted us, or at least, if you're feeling charitable, you could call it a greeting. The Samoan-born sergeant mumbled something in fractured English that was about as easy to decipher as a bad radio signal in a typhoon. His deep, guttural voice resembled the low growl of a particularly irritated Rottweiler more than any human utterance. Still, one phrase came through loud and clear. We were, in his professional opinion, a bunch of sorry-looking excuses for Marines. Allah was the textbook definition of a crusty career Marine, having launched his military journey back during the Korean War. Short, stocky, and built like an armored truck, he had a bulldog's physique paired with the demeanor to match. His dark brown skin underscored his Polynesian heritage, while his two coal-black eyes drilled into you like twin daggers beneath a thick jet-black mustache that nearly swallowed his upper lip. Grudgingly, Sergeant Allo informed us that we'd be assigned to our platoons, eventually, but only after he consulted the commanding officer. Formalities aside, we were then introduced to Corporal Jeff Olson, who took on the noble duty of showing us around the base. Olson, it turns out, had been stuck in the rear recovering from a bout of malaria, but seemed more than happy to stretch his legs by helping two clueless new arrivals find their footing. My name's Jeff Olson, from Crystal Lake, Illinois. Where you two boys from? The Marine, broad-shouldered and rusty-haired, grinned wide and shot out a hand for a firm shake. He was tall and had a red handlebar mustache, which he absent-mindedly stroked like he was plotting a bank heist. I'm Dan Wagoner from Quincy, Illinois, and this here is Dan Wessler from Vancouver, Washington. Quincy? That's Blue Devil country? Olson exclaimed, his grin widening with recognition. I played basketball for Crystal Lake Central, near Chicago. Your Blue Devils snagged second in state back in my junior year. His voice carried the enthusiasm of a man who still relived his high school glory days on occasion. If you know anything about basketball, we should sit down and talk sometime. But for now, let's move it. We've got a lot of ground to cover before nightfall. Olson led us on a whirlwind tour of the supply tent, armory, mess tents, and finally the base infirmary. At the armory, things got real. We were handed our rifles. To my surprise and mild horror, I learned my weapon needed to stay either attached to me like a third arm or locked up tighter than Fort Knox. Turns out, stolen M16s fetched a tidy sum on the black market. The idea that a fellow Marine might swipe my rifle was a hard pill to swallow. Along with the rifles, we were issued 2 bandoliers loaded with 7 magazines of ammunition, and as if that wasn't enough to wake you up, 2 hand grenades each. Over at the supply tent, a PFC handed out gear like he was Santa Claus on a mission. 2 pairs of crisp jungle fatigues, a sturdy pair of jungle boots, a ruck pack, poncho and poncho liner, flak jacket, a steel helmet with camouflage cover, bayonet, folding e-tool, aka the Swiss Army knife of shovels, a webbed belt, and 4 plastic canteens to keep us hydrated and alive out there. You could almost feel the unspoken message, congratulations, you're now fully equipped to sweat, curse, and survive. Later that afternoon, we found ourselves herded into a Vietnam indoctrination lecture. In addition to Golf Company's new recruits, at least 24 more Marines from Hotel, Fox, and Echo companies had piled in with us. Strength in numbers, I suppose. As we perched on uncomfortable wooden benches, we waited for Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hopkins to grace us with his presence. When he finally arrived, we snapped to our feet and stood at attention, our spines as rigid as our nerves. Striding briskly toward the podium at the front, he cut quite the figure, distinguished, confident, and pushing 40. Unlike the rest of us who looked like we'd been dragged through the jungle backward, he was immaculate. His camouflage jungle fatigues were pressed to knife-edge perfection, and his boots gleamed like mirrors in the afternoon sun. It was my first time seeing Marine camo fatigues in the flesh, and compared to our dull, wrinkled olive drabs, they looked like something out of a recruiting poster. Just unfair, really. As you were. Take your seats, the colonel commanded, his voice firm and authoritative. Good morning, gentlemen. I am Lieutenant Colonel Joseph E. Hopkins, your battalion commanding officer. It is a privilege to stand before you as the leader of the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marine Regiment, renowned as one of the most exceptional fighting forces in the annals of military history. Our battalion boasts a storied legacy that traces back to 1914, during the early days of World War I. Since then, the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, has distinguished itself in every major American conflict, from pursuing Pancho Villa across the rugged Mexican terrain to stabilizing a fledgling government in the Dominican Republic. Our moniker, Magnificent Bastards, was earned during our service in China between 1927 and 1941. We fought with unmatched valor in decisive World War II battles, including Guadalcanal, Guam, and Okinawa. We were the first American combat troops to set foot on mainland Japan at the conclusion of World War II, and among the earliest units sent to Vietnam, where we have relentlessly taken the fight to the North Vietnamese forces ever since. Today, it is your time to add your chapter to this proud lineage, Marines. As members of the Magnificent Bastards, you inherit a tradition of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering resolve that has defined this battalion for over a century. Each of you now bears the immense responsibility to carry that legacy forward. As Marines, you embody the highest ideals of discipline, honor, and integrity. You are the living representation of our nation's strength, resilience, and commitment. You must always be ready to answer the call, no matter the sacrifice required, no matter the cost. I am proud to stand alongside you as your commanding officer, and I have absolute faith that together we will continue to uphold the legacy of the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marine Regiment, as the finest fighting force in history. Welcome to the Magnificent Bastards, Marines. Now let's make history. Good luck and Semper Fidelis dismissed.